So today I want to talk about something that most people are completely missing about this war. Everyone is watching the ceasefires that collapse within days. Everyone is watching the diplomatic summits that end without agreement. Everyone is watching the headlines that say negotiations are close, that a deal is near, that both sides are exhausted and ready to stop. But almost nobody is asking the question that actually matters most to ordinary people around the world. What if this war does not end? What if instead of winding down, it is quietly, steadily, and dangerously expanding into new countries, new regions, and new forms of conflict that most people have not even begun to think about? And the answer, when you look at it carefully, is that this war has already crossed borders that most people do not know it has crossed. It is already pulling in actors that the mainstream coverage is barely mentioning. It is already creating consequences for your energy bills, your food prices, your country's economy, your future, that are being driven not by the battles you are reading about, but by the battles and alliances forming in the background. Depending on where you live, depending on how your country is positioned in the expanding geography of this conflict, your life is about to be affected in ways that are very different from what the mainstream narrative is preparing you for. So today I want to walk you through exactly how this war is expanding, where it is heading, who is being pulled in, and what it means for the world. Country by country, front by front. So let us begin. The first thing you need to understand, and the foundation of everything I'm going to tell you today, is a pattern that history shows us again and again, a pattern that most people consistently underestimate when they are living through it. Wars do not follow the logic of the people who start them. They follow their own logic. And the logic of war, far more often than political leaders or military strategists acknowledge, is expansion. Think about how World War I began. A single assassination in Sarajevo in 1914. Within 6 weeks, nearly every major power in Europe had been pulled into a conflict that none of them had planned, none of them had wanted at that scale, and none of them could control once it started. 37 million people died in a war that was supposed to be over by Christmas. Think about the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the conflicts in the Middle East that began as regional disputes and became generational entanglements. The pattern is consistent. What begins as a contained conflict between specific actors in a specific place over a specific grievance rarely stays that way. Because wars create pressures, economic, military, political, that push other actors to get involved, whether they intended to or not. The question is no longer whether this war will affect countries beyond its immediate front lines. It already has. The question is, which countries are being pulled in next? How fast and through what mechanisms? The answer to that question depends on one framework. Who has something significant enough to gain or to lose from how this war ends, that they are now making choices, quietly, carefully, but with real consequences, that are changing the direction of this conflict. The more a country has at stake, the more it is already involved, whether the headlines have caught up with that reality or not. Let me walk you through every major actor in that framework, one by one. On the surface, Russia looks like a country fully consumed by its own conflict. Its economy is under severe sanctions, its military is stretched, its international isolation is near total among Western nations. You might expect Russia to be focused entirely inward, managing its own war, its own pressure, its own survival. But underneath that surface, Russia is one of the most active and least covered actors in the expansion of this conflict. Because Russia has understood something that Western governments have been slow to acknowledge, that the more fronts the West is managing simultaneously, the thinner its attention, its resources, and its political will becomes. A West that is dealing with one crisis at a time is a manageable opponent. A West that is dealing with 3 or 4 crises simultaneously is a West that starts making compromises it would otherwise never consider. Russia's involvement in the expansion of this conflict is not happening on the battlefield directly. It is happening through intelligence sharing, through weapons supply chains, through diplomatic cover at the United Nations, and through energy politics. Russia supplies approximately 8% of global oil and 17% of global natural gas. In a world where energy supply chains are already under pressure, Russia's ability to tighten or loosen that supply is a form of warfare that does not require a single soldier to cross a single border. If Russia redirects its energy exports, adjusts its alliances, or provides critical support to actors who are expanding this conflict, the chain of consequences moves outward immediately, into energy prices, into inflation, into the economic calculations of governments trying to decide how much they can afford to care about a war that is happening far away. For ordinary families in Europe, the people sitting between Russia's energy leverage and the demands of the conflict they are being asked to support, this means that the economic pressure they are already feeling is not going to ease. It is going to intensify. Now let us look at a nation whose involvement is even more direct and even less understood. On the surface, Iran looks like a country that has absorbed an extraordinary amount of military and economic punishment. Its infrastructure has been targeted. Its economy has been under sanctions for decades. Its military capacity has been degraded by direct strikes. The mainstream narrative around Iran in this conflict is mostly about how much it has lost. But underneath that surface, Iran is the single most important driver of this war's expansion. Not because it is winning, it is not in the conventional military sense, but because Iran has spent 40 years building something that no military strike can destroy in a few months: a network. Iran's strategic network, Hezbollah in Lebanon, proxy forces in Iraq, aligned groups in Yemen and Syria, represents a form of warfare that operates below the threshold of direct state conflict. These are not armies that can be defeated on a single battlefield. They are distributed, deeply embedded in civilian populations, and sustained by a combination of ideology, local grievance, and Iranian financial and material support that has continued even under extreme pressure. Here is the specific number that tells you everything you need to know about the scale of this network. Iran has spent an estimated $16 billion over the past 2 decades building and sustaining proxy forces across the region. That investment does not disappear when infrastructure is bombed. It activates. Every time this conflict escalates, every time a strike hits Iranian soil, every time a red line is crossed, Iran does not respond by fighting the war on the terms its opponents prefer. It responds by activating different parts of the network in different countries, creating new fronts that the other side now has to manage. For ordinary families in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Syria, people who are not parties to the original conflict and never asked to be, this expansion means that the war is arriving in their lives regardless of what their government has decided. That is the most important and least reported consequence of Iran's strategic approach. Now let us look at the power that is watching all of this most carefully of all. On the surface, China looks like a bystander in this conflict. It has called for restraint. It has offered diplomatic language about peaceful solutions. It has presented itself as a neutral party, concerned about stability and opposed to escalation. That is what China says publicly. But underneath that surface, China is making calculations about this conflict that are among the most consequential of any actor in the world. Because China understands that the expansion of this war is reshaping the global order in ways that directly affect China's long-term strategic position. And not all of those ways are unwelcome to Beijing. Every month that the United States is deeply engaged in this conflict is a month in which American attention, American military resources, and American diplomatic bandwidth is directed away from the Indo-Pacific, away from Taiwan, away from the South China Sea, away from the alliances in East Asia that are the primary check on Chinese power in the region. China's imports from the Middle East, including approximately 40% of its total energy needs, give it a direct economic stake in the conflict's outcome. But its strategic stake is even larger. China is watching how the United States manages this expansion. It is watching whether American alliances hold under pressure. It is watching whether the global financial system, the U.S. dollar-based system that China has been quietly building alternatives to, shows the cracks that a prolonged and expanding conflict might open. China is not fighting this war, but China is learning from it, preparing from it, and in some ways benefiting from the pressure it places on the Western-led order. For ordinary Chinese families, that abstraction may feel remote. But the decisions Beijing makes now, based on what it learns from watching this conflict expand, will shape China's choices about its own regional ambitions for years to come. Now let us talk about the nation that is most directly caught in the crossfire of the expansion. On the surface, Turkey looks like a NATO ally, a member of the Western Alliance, formally committed to the collective defense of its partners, with one of the largest standing armies in NATO and a strategic position that controls the straits connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. But underneath that surface, Turkey is one of the most complex and most independently minded actors in this expanding conflict. Turkey has maintained trade with Russia despite Western sanctions. It has sold military drones to Ukraine while simultaneously pursuing its own negotiations with Moscow. It has positioned itself as an indispensable mediator, the country that can talk to all sides precisely because it has refused to fully align with any of them. Turkey sits at the geographic intersection of three expanding fronts simultaneously: the Russia-Ukraine conflict to its north, the Middle Eastern conflict to its south, and the pressure from its NATO allies to its west. No other country in the world is managing that particular combination. Here's what that means in practice. Turkey controls the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits, the only maritime route between the Black Sea and the open ocean. Under the Montreux Convention, Turkey has the legal authority to restrict warship passage through those straits in times of conflict. That geographic and legal leverage makes Turkey one of the most strategically important countries in the world right now, regardless of how it chooses to use it. For ordinary Turkish families living at the intersection of all these expanding pressures, the conflict means inflation, economic volatility, and a government that is constantly having to perform an extraordinarily difficult balancing act between partners whose interests are increasingly incompatible. It is a position that brings Turkey leverage, but also extraordinary risk. Now let us turn to the actor that most people have forgotten to include in this analysis at all. On the surface, the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, look like passive observers of this expanding conflict. Rich, well-protected behind American security guarantees, and primarily concerned with their own economic diversification away from oil dependency. But underneath that surface, the Gulf states are making some of the most consequential financial and diplomatic bets of any actors in the world right now. And they are making those bets in multiple directions simultaneously. Saudi Arabia has deepened its relationship with China, signing major energy and investment agreements that bypass the US dollar. The UAE has maintained open trade relationships with Russia despite Western pressure. Qatar, home to the largest American military base in the Middle East, simultaneously hosts leadership figures from Hamas and maintains some of the most active back-channel diplomacy in the region. These are not contradictory positions. They are the deliberate strategy of states that have decided the era of exclusive American alignment is over, and that the future belongs to whoever maintains the most options. The Gulf states collectively hold sovereign wealth funds totaling over $3.5 trillion. How they choose to deploy that capital, which economies they invest in, which alliances they strengthen, which emerging powers they back, will shape the financial landscape of the post-conflict world more than almost any other single factor. For ordinary families in the Gulf, the expansion of this conflict feels close in a way it does not in other parts of the world. The missiles that have hit Gulf infrastructure, the questions about the reliability of American protection, the realization that the security guarantees that underpinned everything were never as unconditional as they appeared. All of this is creating a new and uncomfortable awareness of vulnerability in societies that were built on the assumption of permanent safety. So now let us zoom out and look at the biggest picture of all. Because when you step back from each individual actor and look at all of them together, a pattern becomes visible that is far more significant than any single country's involvement. What is happening in this conflict is not a series of separate decisions by separate actors, each responding to their own local pressures and interests. What is happening is the systematic erosion of the architecture that kept wars contained for the past 80 years. After World War II, the world built a set of institutions, agreements, and norms specifically designed to prevent regional conflicts from becoming global ones. The United Nations Security Council, international law, mutual defense treaties, economic interdependence. The idea was that if nations were sufficiently connected, financially, diplomatically, commercially, the cost of allowing any conflict to escalate beyond a certain point would always outweigh the potential benefit. That architecture is now failing. Not dramatically, not all at once, but piece by piece, in ways that individually seem manageable and collectively are not. Russia has demonstrated that a major power can invade a neighbor and absorb the economic consequences while maintaining the support of a significant portion of the world. Iran has demonstrated that a heavily sanctioned state can still sustain a multi-country network of influence and resistance. China has demonstrated that the world's second-largest economy can watch its strategic rivals become exhausted and simply wait. And the Gulf states have demonstrated that even formal allies can pursue independent strategies when they calculate that their interests are no longer fully aligned with their protectors. And here is the crucial insight that most people are completely missing. The expansion of this war is not being driven primarily by military decisions on the battlefield. It is being driven by the collapse of confidence in the system that was supposed to prevent expansion. When enough actors stop believing that the rules will be enforced, the rules stop working. And when the rules stop working, every actor that has grievances, ambitions, or fears starts making calculations it would never have made when the system felt solid. We are at that point now. The expansion of this conflict is not an accident or a failure of specific leaders. It is the predictable consequence of a global order whose foundations have been quietly weakening for years, and which this conflict has now pushed past a critical threshold. I want to end with the most surprising conclusion in this entire analysis. I want to tell you which actor is most likely to benefit from the expansion of this conflict, and it is almost certainly not the actor you are expecting. You might expect me to say Russia, which benefits from a West divided and distracted, or China, which benefits from American resources being consumed far from the Indo-Pacific. Those analyses are not wrong, but they are not the full answer. The actor that stands to gain the most from this expanding conflict is India, and here is why. India imports the majority of its energy needs, which is a genuine vulnerability. But India has also spent the past decade doing something extraordinarily sophisticated. It has maintained working relationships with every major power simultaneously. It buys Russian oil at discounted prices while sitting in Western-aligned forums. It trades extensively with China while hosting American military exercises. It accepts Gulf investment while criticizing Gulf-aligned positions at the United Nations. India calls this strategic autonomy. Its critics call it inconsistency. But in a world where the old alliances are fracturing, strategic autonomy is not a weakness. It is the most valuable asset a nation can have. As this war expands, every major power is becoming more desperate for reliable partners who are not already committed to the other side. America needs manufacturing alternatives to China. The Gulf needs large, stable markets for its energy. Russia needs economies that will not join Western sanctions. China needs diplomatic voices that have credibility in both the East and the West. India qualifies for all of those roles simultaneously. And as the conflict expands, the price India can charge for its cooperation in technology transfers, in investment flows, in diplomatic support rises with every new front that opens. This is not weakness adapting to chaos. This is wisdom positioning ahead of it. India did not design this conflict, but it has positioned itself, perhaps better than any other major power, to navigate it. That is the insight that the mainstream coverage of this expanding war consistently misses. So let us just recap what we covered today. Russia is not a passive actor in this expansion. It is actively using energy leverage, intelligence support, and diplomatic cover to multiply the pressures on the Western-led response without committing to a direct second front of its own. Iran is the expansion engine. Its 40-year investment in a regional proxy network means that every escalation activates new fronts in new countries that its opponents must now manage simultaneously. Military strikes degrade its capacity. they do not dissolve the network. China is watching and learning. Every month of Western engagement in this conflict is a month of reduced American attention in the Indo-Pacific. China is drawing precise conclusions about American staying power, alliance reliability, and the durability of the dollar-based financial system. Turkey is the most geographically exposed actor in the world right now, sitting at the intersection of three expanding fronts simultaneously. Its leverage is real, its risk is real, and its balancing act grows harder with every new escalation. The Gulf states are hedging in every direction at once, maintaining American partnerships while deepening ties with China and Russia. Their $3.5 trillion in sovereign wealth gives them more influence over the post-conflict financial order than almost any other actor. And India, the actor almost nobody names when they discuss this conflict's expansion, is the most strategically positioned nation in the world to benefit from the fragmentation of the old global order, precisely because it never fully committed to that order in the first place.